Okay. Well, we missed the last time, and we will start where we left off on Steve Fleetwood's article. Part two, value theory, as noted in the introduction. The existence not only of numerous versions of the labor theory of value, the LTV, but also numerous methodological approaches requires the employment of two generalizing devices. First, I differentiate between quantitative and qualitative versions of the LTV. Sorry. Placing all versions in one or other of these categories. Second, I argue that basically there are only two modes of theorization, namely deductivist and causal explanatory. Placing all modes of theorization in one or another of these categories. Now, just let me break here for a second. And deductivist and causal explanatory, as we noted as in the first part of this it's not arbitrary, but there is a specific reason why he's doing it this way, and weighs in on the side of critical realism's desire to provide a wider range of explanatory elements and to oppose kind of deductivist and ultimately positivist points of view. So anyway, and the point, of course, in all underlying all of this is that it's still, and we could have an argument there that critical realism, is historically materialist as well. Whether it is or isn't, that's a whole nother set of questions, but one worth pursuing. So 2.1, quantitative versions of the LTV, as the name implies, quantitative versions of the LTV deal explicitly with the alleged quantitative relationship between the expenditure of a quantity of labor power and the resultant commodity value, price of production, market value, or market price. Now, alleged quantitative relationship is, obviously another issue. The term quantitative as used here applies equally to both, as we looked at before, the difference between an econometric model and a toy model. Toy implying a more theoretical, less empirical in terms of econometric construction. Now, the point, of course, is that can you easily bifurcate that? But anyway, models are quantitative in the sense that when definite magnitudes are attached to concepts like labor, value, and price, they're transformed into variables, whereupon they can be dealt with in terms of functional relations and/or laws. Though a little dated, Meek's work has the merit of succinctly elaborating the conventional wisdom underlying quantitative versions of the LTV, namely the alleged existence of an important functional relationship between embodied labor and individual equilibrium prices, which may be expressed in the following symbolic form. Note that this functional relationship is one that is pursued in greater detail by people like Jerry Cohen. at least from the logical point of view. So following symbolic form, price of quantity equals C plus V over the sum of C plus V times the sum of S. He then adds, since all the terms on the right-hand side of the formula are expressible in terms of quantities of embodied labor, it can plausibly be maintained that there still is a causal connection, however indirect and circuitous, between values and prices of production. Put simply, quantitative versions of the LTV allege the existence of a causal connection between quantities of labor and prices. Causal connection. This connection is also evident in more recent forms of expression. Consider a fairly typical price of production model. P equals bracket P capital A plus W capital I time bracket I plus I plus alpha, I plus gamma, sorry, where P is a vector of production prices. Gamma is the equalized rate of profit. Sorry, that's subscript R. Um, sorry, all right. R is the equalized rate of profit. W is the wage rate. A, the technology matrix, is an expression for the means of production set in motion by I, the vector of labor hours used. So you see an integration of production prices, uh, rate of profit, wage rate, technology matrix, that is the means of production set in motion by I, that is the vector of labor hours used. This equation suggests once again that a causal connection exists between labor input and prices. As noted above, causal connections like these can be expressed in functional relations, such as P equal F F of I, that is ceteris paribus, whenever event I, a change in labor input, then event P, change in price. Or more generally, when event X, then event Y. And that alone may be problematic. Now, models like these are clear examples of the type of toy models discussed above and exemplified by Shapiro and Stiglitz's model of shirking behavior. Model 2 effectively says if R, W, and A remain unchanged, the change in I always causes a change in P. I will neither repeat the four reasons why constant conjunctions of events are built into the model of the LTV, nor the reasons why constant conjunctions can be expressed in terms of toy and or econometric models, because the arguments are exactly the same as those to illustrate the shirking model that was discussed in section 1.1. Now, what is significant for our purposes, however, is the crucial role played by constant conjunctions of events. Without constant conjunction of events, quantitative versions of the LTV, rooted as they are in the deductivist mode of theorization, simply do not get off the ground because they lack causal connections. Critical realist critique of deductivist versions of the LTV. Part 1 established that the deductivist mode of theorization suffers from two major flaws. First, a series of problems arise when analysis is couched in terms of closed systems. Second, lacking explanatory power, the deductivist mode falls back on deduction, prediction, solution, determination, and calculations as objectives of theorization. In what follows, I demonstrate that exactly the same flaws afflict quantitative versions of the LTV using the example of Model 2. The aim of the following four subsections is to show how Model 2 has to be specified to maintain the closure conditions. It also reveals the extensive use of falsehoods, which we picked up again in section 2.4. Subsection I, intrinsic closure conditions. The ICC, intrinsic closure conditions, is satisfied when the individual is specified atomistically, which is another way of saying that they're specified as homo economus. Now, one might however, object that no individuals are specified in Model 2, in which case they cannot be specified atomistically, and hence the ICC is irrelevant in this context. Now, this objection fails to see that although no individuals are explicitly specified, they are implicitly presupposed. Presupposed individuals include laborers, capitalists, productive systems, firms, unions, consumers, and so on. Now, consider the case of expectations. Expectations are especially important for the more recent versions of the LTV because they are keen to emphasize how real or chronological time matters. An agent specified non-atomistically has the power to formulate expectations, whereas if specified atomistically, this property is removed by assumption. Bellafiore alerts us to the way expectations on the part of workers and capitalists play a role in forming prices when expected prices are or are not translated into actual prices. Model 2 assumes total income is sufficient to purchase the total output in order to ensure reproduction, but expectations, when frustrated, can prevent reproduction. Some capitalists will make errors of judgment and will be forced into bankruptcy, leaving creditors unpaid and workers made redundant with various knock-on effects for expectation. In order to ensure reproduction, however, the model either assumes that these agents are not included or that all expectations are fulfilled. Either way, this is tantamount to falsely assuming that agents are atomistic or that there are no expectations. So there's a circularity, I think, there. Subsection 2, the extrinsic closure condition, the ECC. The ECC ensures that the system is completely isolated from any external influences. So Model 2 falsely ignores a range of external influences such as supply and demand, technological innovation, recession, government policy, political ideology, and so on. To be sure, the advocates of these models are well aware of the role played by these factors, and some have been captured within the formation of socially necessary labor, but others simply have to be ignored because including them would make the system unstable. Let me break here for a second. And, there's far too many other options relative to the definition of the socially necessary labor. But anyway, I mean, there can be exceptions, I would assert. Anyway, subsection 3, the aggregational closure condition. Remember, we've looked at this, the way in which these are divided as intrinsic, extrinsic, aggregational, etc. Aggregational closure condition, ACC. The ACC ensures that when individual entities combine into groups, the behavior of the group remains as predictable as the individuals that constitute it. Consider the labor input. The vector of labor hours used, I, does not specify anything about the composition of those who supply these labor hours. However, it must be implicitly assumed falsely that no matter how many or few laborers are buried within the vector I, the effect on output remains constant. The ACC is maintained by implicit assumption. Subsection 4. Now, the reliability closure subcondition. So this is capital R, capital C, sub lowercase s, and capital C. RCSC. Deducing a unique solution requires assumption of tractability. These are merely technical assumptions whose sole purpose is to ensure the relative functions are well behaved, thereby preventing perverse outcomes. So there's already a kind of optimizing going on. In Model 2, the matrix A expresses that technology or machinery that is activated via labor. In the matrix A, Aij at A sub I sub J represents the quantity of ith output used to produce a unit, ith input used to produce a unit of output. The relation between inputs and outputs from the machinery operating in conjunction with labor is assumed never to falter and to be known a priori. As the most powerful Marxist labor process theory reveals, this is an unreasonable false assumption. The point is that it and or assumptions like it must be made totally solely for purposes of mathematical tractability. Points 1 to 4 demonstrate that Model 2 is an example of a closed system. As such, it reproduces the problematic and counterintuitive implications noted in section 1.2, and thereby immediately falls foul of the critical realist critique. Moreover, the need to maintain closure makes it necessary to proceed by assuming that there are no expectations, assuming that no matter how many labors are buried within the vector I, the effect on output remains constant, assuming the relations between inputs and outputs is assumed never to falter and or ignoring a range of external influences such as supply and demand, technological innovation, recession, government policy, political ideology, and so on. So allow me to make two observations here to prevent any misunderstanding. First observation, I'm sure that advocates of qualitative versions of the LTV are well aware of the range of causal influences that are important for considerations of value. The problem is that they have no choice but to leave them out of the model. For example, quantitative versions of the LTV can be augmented to encompass things like technological change resulting in workplace closures and restructuring, unemployment, state intervention and regulation, declining profit rates, and crisis. But this argumentation cannot be accomplished via the deductive model of reasoning, nor on the basis of closed systems, because these factors do not manifest themselves as constant. This is the criterion here. What is a constant conjunction of events? Now, we'll discuss probably constant conjunctions of events later, but I would assert to you that there is a kind of ontological or phenomenological element to this that needs to be fleshed out further, but it is also materialist in that particular context. The actual level of unemployment is multi-causal and cannot be deduced or predicted from, say, a change in technology. It is not empirically true to say that some technological change, X, causes a reduction in employment, Y. Hence, one cannot meaningfully bolt a chain of theoretical pronouncements about things like technology and unemployment onto quantitative models like Model 2. Furthermore, the above, by no means exhaustive range of assumptions illustrate the use of known falsehoods and or falsehood by omission. The significance of such falsehoods will be discussed in a moment. Now, the second observation is that Model 2 contains a vector for labor I. Now, what kind of labor is this? What models of this kind almost never spell it out? It does appear to be the kind of labor that could be observed interacting with the technology A, interacting with technology A and receiving a wage W, i.e., it is individual and concrete labor. Yet for Marx, the substance of value is socially necessary and abstract labor. The substance of value is socially necessary and abstract labor. Whilst, to put matters very simply, the mechanisms that constitute the market are also those that facilitate the doubling of individual and concrete labor into itself. And socially necessary abstract labor. At worst, the market is simply ignored in quantitative models, and at best, whatever the market does, it is presumed to have already done it. Now, how this individual and concrete labor doubles into a unity of itself and socially necessary abstract labor is a mystery that no deductivist model could even begin to explain, because they do not have the intellectual apparatus to deal with such qualitative issues. Should any such explanation be given, it would be an add-on to the model. Now, Whatever the merits of the model, then, the explanatory power would lie somewhere else, elsewhere. Now it's time to discuss explanation more fully, which is the whole point of this entire exercise in terms of critical realism. When considering models like number two, I am often minded to ask, do they actually explain anything? In a recent, and I must add, extremely interesting paper, Saad Philo offers a clue, writing, quote, this equation expresses the definition of price of production, and it can theoretically be used to calculate the price vector. However, the equation does not explain the logical determination of price, nor the relationship between price and value. So there's something, you know, problematic here, perhaps. So if the model does not explain the logical determination of price, nor the relation between price and value, what does it explain? Now, arguably, models like this, rooted as they are in the deductivist mode of theorization, offer no explanation whatsoever. The reasons are as follows. Explanation is not merely efficient causality. The explanation of a phenomenon is irreducible to a statement of the event that happens to precede it. How, unfortunately, for models rooted in the deductivist model of theorization, this is precisely all that they have to offer. All Model 2 states, therefore, is that if RW and A, capital A, remain unchanged, then a change in P can be deduced from a change in I. If one asks what explains this change in P, the only explanation on offer is the change in I that preceded it. So there's a contiguity or seriality kind of idea going on here. Subsection 2, explanation is not predictive, is not prediction. You can see how you could get there, though, from this, right? Because of seriality or contiguity or whatever. As an example of a toy model, Model 2 does not make empirical predictions. Whilst it could be specified econometrically for this purpose, it would still not constitute an explanation because prediction does not constitute explanation. All Model 2 allows us to do is to calculate the price vector, that is, deduce the vector of prices consistent with the data on a highly restricted number of variables, namely interest rates, wages, and technology. In both of the above cases, the need to engineer closed systems requires the removal, theoretically, of course, of all potential causal factors, such as transfactually operating causal mechanisms, structures, and powers, because these would all almost certainly violate the closure conditions. Once removed from the model, these factors cannot subsequently be recalled and offered as part of the causal explanation. Let me break here for a moment, and you might say this is kind of underlying some ideas, perhaps, of what Anwar Sheikh talks about in terms of kind of a turbulent model for capital, and which appeals to the idea of the classical as opposed to a more specific, Marxian model or the obvious neoclassical models, etc. So now it's not so much an in-betweenness so much as it is a different path, perhaps. Anyway, subsection 3. Explanation does not allow known falsehoods. If, as part of this causal story, one opts to include a known falsehood, or which amounts to the same thing, leaves out some important causal factor, that is, falsehood by omission. With all due respect, this is, kind of how legal discourse operates. And then the explanation can always be objected to by simply pointing to this falsehood. As noted above, Model 2 is replete with falsehoods. Moreover, the further one delves into models like number 2, the more one uncovers implicitly and explicitly false assumptions. To show how this can be done, consider the following. In the deductive mode of theorization, the constant conjunctions of events often drives the inferential machinery by providing the covering law. There's a lot packed in there and literally whole subfields, but you can sort of see what that implies. Now, whilst the covering law in use here is the law of value, it is understood in thoroughly Humean terms. And see, that gets us off into another place. But anyway, is understood in thoroughly Humean terms. That is, the law of value is treated as a constant conjunction of events. Recall above that model 2 can be conceived of in terms of a functional relation I equal f of I. This implies that a change in the magnitude of labor input causes a change in the magnitude of price, ceteris paribus. Now, as we saw, this can be generalized using the Humean formula whenever X, then event Y. Now, the problem with this Humean way of interpreting the law of value is that it is empirically false. Correlation, causation, blah, blah, blah. It is, I suggest, self-evidently true that there is no such constancy between an increase in the amount of labor and an increase in the value production price of that market value or market price of the commodity. After all, this is why Marx introduces the term socially necessary labor. In other words, Marx is trying to build a contingency in this of some kind. There are, however, counter arguments that are often deployed to legitimize the use of known falsehoods. This is the entire Trump administration. The first is a retreat to spurious accounts of abstraction. The second turns on the method of successive approximations or isolation. Now, since they're common objections, it's important to show they cannot carry the weight of the counter argument. The retreat to spurious abstraction. Now, the first counter argument runs as follows. All theory has to leave out the inessential, has to abstract from reality. That is, all theory has to leave out the inessential, has to abstract from reality, has to make unrealistic assumptions. So all theory is inevitably false in the strict sense of the word. Now, whilst the process of abstraction is complex and cannot be elaborated upon here, although I think he should, I simply put the following point to the reader. Models like number 2 are replete with fictions, and to suggest that they're really abstractions is merely a neat piece of footwork to try and avoid having to discuss methodology. Now, that's sort of an interesting argument. Furthermore, whilst mainstream economists can, in a sense, be forgiven for this retreat to a spurious account of abstraction because their canon has never discussed abstraction, Marxist economists have no such excuse. As Marx himself put matters, quote, in the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use. The force of abstraction must replace both. Now, whilst Marx never really elaborated upon the notion of abstraction, which is what reason why we've been looking at issues of subsumption, et cetera, to try and get a better handle on it, others have. And the need to take abstraction seriously is widely recognized in Marxist circles. It is just ignored when the deductive mode of theorization is employed to formulate quantitative versions of the LTV. So, this is that you could say it's a kind of a ceteris paribus problem there as well. Anyway, method of successive approximation of successive isolation. Now, the second counter argument runs as follows. Models like 2 are very simple and necessarily make many unrealistic assumptions. This, however, is an initial stage of theorization. Explanatory power can be added via the progressive relaxing of these unrealistic assumptions. The method being employed then is the method of successive approximation. And so, or the method of isolation. So Sweezy in 68, Maki in 92 probably need to be consulted. So, whilst a thoroughgoing critique of this defense cannot be undertaken here, the following brief comments can be made. First, the method of successive approximation or isolation would be appropriate in two situations that almost never arise in the socioeconomic world. Subsection 1, when the factors considered in isolation express reality and are not falsehoods. That is, when the earlier analytical stages involve the use of falsehoods like no frustrated expectations, and succession is one of falsehood built upon falsehood. Now, while there is logical consistency there, that, it is. Anyway, number two, when the successive analytical steps merely involve the mechanical adding in of factors that were previously excluded, and the overall outcome is a resultant. Now, this mechanical addition is, however, not appropriate for systems where the elements possess emergent properties. So, when, for example, new technology is introduced to a workplace, a new management regime is installed. The workforce grows to a particular size, or the workforce becomes unionized, its behavior evolves so that various accounts of its behavior are obsolete. Any theoretical propositions that were deduced on the basis of the previous account are immediately invalidated and provide no basis for the mechanical addition of new sets of behavior, close quote. Second, none of this overcomes the objection that the model is still rooted in a closed system approach. All that has happened is that one closed system has been added to another, slightly broader closed system. A bundle of sequentially closed systems do not, however, add up to an open system. One cannot, for example, start with a model that assumes price is reducible to dated inputs of individual and concrete labor and deduce a set of conclusions from this. Then relax this assumption and assume that the price is governed by socially necessary abstract labor, because if the latter is true, then the former is false. And so the conclusions derived from it were also false. Now, the method of successive approximations or successive closures might, therefore, be more accurately termed the method of successive falsehoods, or the method of successive closed systems. Now, it appears that quantitative versions of the LTV, rooted as they are in the deductivist mode of theorization and its emaciated ontology, reproduce the two major flaws afflicting this mode in general. First, they engender a series of problems arising from analysis couched in terms of closed systems when socioeconomic reality is an open system. Second, lacking explanatory power, quantitative versions of the LTV substitute prediction, deduction, solution, determination, and calculation as the objectives of science. Devoid of explanatory power, the only thing left to do, and so the whole point of constructing quantitative versions of the LTV is to calculate the price vector. And that really is that. So this state of affairs make quantitative versions of the LTV not so much wrong as irrelevant. Performing formal operations such as calculating the price vector in a model that has no connection to reality is as irrelevant as calculating the speed of a pig flying between London and New York. 2.3. The final qualitative versions of the LTV as causal explanatory. Now, this final section argues that not only that Marx appears to have employed something like the causal explanatory mode, but more importantly, that this mode encourages the formulation of qualitative versions of the LTV that possess explanatory power. Now, Marx starts from the stylized fact, quote unquote, that under capitalism, in contrast to all other forms of production, human laboring activity appears in an estranged or alienated form. It appears in the form of the products this laboring activity produces, namely commodities as values. See, there's a lot, right? All there. That's like chapter 1 in Capital, right? Quote, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of the commodity. This starting point appears to be motivated by something like the following transcendental question. That is, what economic, social, political, ideological relations, that is, mechanisms, structures, powers, and so on, would explain how and why human laboring activity appears in the value form. So Marx reintroduces us, perhaps, reintroduces to a set of underlying relations. Deep structures and connects them in their observable forms. Their observable forms. Although Marx does not, of course, explain this modus approach in these terms, it appears to be perfectly acceptable, although not a well-known interpretation. So, for example, according to Andrew Sayer, quote, Marx's object is the social forms assumed by economic phenomena. His analytic consists of an excavation of the conditions that must be supposed for the phenomena to assume such forms, that is, of the essential relations that must exist if the world as experience is to be possible. Marx's reasoning is thus eminently transcendental, although Pache Kant, his is a transcendental realism, close quote. This is Sayer, 1979. Now, not only is Marx's ontology stratified, but also transformational. So according to the Marxian TMSA presented here, society is the ensemble of material, technical, and socioeconomic relations. Ensemble. These relations are, however, not thrown together in a heap. There is a principle of organization, and that principle is transformation. The relations are treated as the ever-present condition and the continually reproduced outcome of human agency. As Marx, preempting critical realistic terminology, puts matters, quote, the conditions of the direct production process are themselves equally moments of it, and its only subjects are the individuals, but individuals in mutual relationships which they equally reproduce and produce anew. The constant processes of their own movement in which they renew themselves, even as they renew the world of the wealth they create. So recall that, well, close quote, recall that this is that idea that this is not it's not a rigid process, and that it does have this constant set of ideas or motions or whatever, a kind of movement in it. Anyway, close quote, whilst Marx appears to make use of something like the stratified and transformational ontology set out above, he adds another element. That is, and this is probably the key point in this article, the ontology is also fetishized. Now, to say that things are fetishized means that there is a rather special relationship with the way things are and the way that they appear. Now, it's not just that things appear in a distorted form, but A, the distortion is systematic, and that B, this systematically distorted form, is the only way that those things can appear. So the following diagram not only summarizes the stratified, transformational, and fetishized ontologies presupposed by the labor theory of value, but also illustrates how this can be interpreted along critical realist lines. So stratified, transformational, fetishized ontology. So this is the chart, figure 4, Marx's stratified and fetishized socioeconomic ontology. Now, you can see the first column, right, is empirical, actual, and deep, that corresponds to our prior figures. The entity is under the empirical is the exchange of money for commodities, and that actually seems quite logical, right? And then there's the coordination of the laboring activity of millions of atomistic producing units. And then deep, which is material, technical, and socioeconomic relations, private property, alienated labor, the state, and so on. So there is, it's stratified, it's hierarchical, it has fetishistic elements in it uh, that I think for some people it can be difficult. So from critical realism to Marx, the causal explanatory mode of theorizing and the socioeconomic ontology in which it's rooted generates an entirely different problematic to that generated by the deductivist mode of theorization underlying quantitative versions of the LTV. The causal explanatory mode encourages an inquiry into the nature of alienated laboring activity and its form of appearance, whereas the deductivist mode inquires solely into the magnitude of value. Now, without the intellectual apparatus with which to carry out an inquiry into qualitative phenomena such as these, deductivism is capable of doing no more than dealing with quantitative phenomena such as value magnitudes. Now, for some people, that may be enough. Using the causal explanatory mode of theorization and explicitly recognizes this structured, transformational, and fetishized socioeconomic ontology, one is encouraged to interpret the problematic of Marx's LTV as follows. What deep structures, that is, mechanisms, relations, and powers, are necessary to sustain a system whereby the relationship between people as producing units appear in the form of a relation between things, that is, commodities? So this is an important, there's a lot here to work through. Now, so in addressing this problematic, I will make use of contrastive explanation. I will not ask, why does laboring activity under capitalist conditions appear in the value form? Rather, I will ask, why does laboring activity under capitalist conditions appear in the value form when laboring activity under non-capitalist conditions does not require this form? So framing the explanation in terms of this contrast pinpoints what is essential to capitalism. Now, this is the whole point of, engaging in a contrastive kind of analysis where you're always comparing, you're indulging or participating in a kind of a difference or differentiating exercise. But anyway, as it happens, this is exactly how Rubin 1990, Chapter 2 proceeds. Although he does not mention the mode of reasoning he uses, I will follow Rubin by comparing relations under a stylized, non-capitalist system to relations under a stylized capitalist system in order to bring out the specifics of the latter. Now, you can see the structure of the argument resembles that of, positing techno-feudalism or whatever. These things are possible in that particular kind of context. Let us begin, however, by reflecting upon the centrality of laboring activity, reminding ourselves that, as Elson puts it, the labor theory of value is primarily about labor and the form of value that it takes. So it's not a labor theory of value. It ought to be described as the value theory of labor. Now, that can take you in a lot of other different directions, but it's kind of interesting and certainly linguistically interesting. You know. Anyway, at the basis of all human life is a material technical transformation brought about by laboring activity, whereby matter is transformed from one state to another, more useful state. This material technical process is characterized by the following points. And these are important points, right? And points that, I don't think you can separate out. Spatially, temporally universal. It results in the production of a good or service and relates, therefore, to the domain of use value. Number three, it requires material technical coordination. That is, raw materials and machinery must be spatially and temporally coordinated. And number four, this coordination is ensured if, when, and to the extent that material technical relations are established. Now, this is what Marx has in mind when he refers to the material relations between things. Now, if this material technical transformation is to occur, however, millions of isolated atomized producers must enter into relations to coordinate and regulate their laboring activities. And this entails a socioeconomic process characterized by the following points. That is, material transformation occurs by humans coordinating and regulating their socioeconomic activities. Thus, material-technical relations necessarily imply socioeconomic relations. Number two, not only are various material entities produced and reproduced, but so too are the relations into which people have entered. Now, the socioeconomic process captures social relations between people as opposed to material relations between things. This is what Marx has in mind when he refers to the social relations between people. Socioeconomic relations are spatio-temporally specific, and that the mode of coordination of humans differs fundamentally in space and between epochs. Now, although human laboring activity is spatio-temporally universal, the forms in which it appears is spatially temporally specific. Spatio-temporally specific. While the concern is with the forms under which laboring activity occurs under capitalism, one way of actually grasping the specifics of this form is to contrast it with stylized non-capitalist forms. Stylized non-capitalist system, what is that? Consider a highly abstract, stylized, non-capitalist system such as a slave society, feudal society, Stalinist planned economy, or even a capitalist enterprise consisting of spatially differentiated production sites. You can see where that could go, right? Production takes place on isolated, unconnected production sites and requires the existence of a conscious agency, i.e., a slave owner, a feudal lord, a central planner, or a manager to design and oversee a production plan. Although the actual administration of the plan might be very difficult, the principle upon which it works, however badly, is quite straightforward. This conscious agency, possessing knowledge of material, technical properties of things and production sites, ensures that labor, semi-finished objects, and raw materials are spatio-temporally distributed in accordance with the technical requirements of the various stages of the production process. Things flow from production site A to B to C, etc., because the conscious agency, knowing a range of material technical properties, knows that each subsequent site has the technical ability to transform the thing into some other thing that is more useful. By issuing instructions based upon only material technical properties, relations are established between the sites. The relations that ensure the uninterrupted coordination of things are permanent, direct, and social. Now, they're permanent because once they're established by the conscious agency, they endure until removed or altered. Number two, they are direct because they are established without the intervention of any other vehicle. The connection is directly between plant and plant at the behest of the conscious agency. Also, they are social because the central agency has already socially sanctioned the products and thereby the human labor expended upon them. Sanctioning occurs typically in the interests of the central agency. Now, under the stylized non-capitalist system, then, things move between productive stages because some conscious central agency possessing knowledge of material technical properties of things in production sites is able to establish a set of permanent and directly social relations to coordinate production. The things themselves are, however, unimportant for the establishment of the relations which coordinate the processes that produce them. The importance of this will become clear in a moment. This is to, create an argument, a structural argument for the, deep things, systemic thing. Stylized capitalist system as opposed to stylized non-capitalist system. A capitalist socioeconomic system is one where laboring activity is carried out by millions of atomized, isolated individual producing units, ranging from the self-employed to the transnational corporation. These producers never meet to discuss the coordination of their laboring activities, nor are their activities coordinated by a central agency. Yet clearly, their laboring activity is coordinated, however badly, or the socioeconomic system would grind to a halt. Laboring activities are indirectly coordinated via the systematic exchange of the products of these very activities, commodities. And the systematic exchange of commodities involves the systematic evaluation of these commodities. That is, the assignment of appropriate value, or more concretely, money, price tags. So in this stylized capitalist system, the three production sites mentioned above, ABC, are now owned by completely different firms. Things still circulate between individual production sites, but now for different reasons. Things pass from A to B, not because of any technical ability possessed by B to transform that object into something useful, although this is an obvious presupposition, but because a sum of money passes from B to A. Things pass from A to B, and then a sum of money passes from B to A. Firm A is no longer interested in firms B's technical technical ability to transform things. Are no longer merely given away, but are now sold. So there's a system of abstraction at work here, right? And literally, you can see this in more material versions of commodity markets, for example. Or you could suppose that, I suppose. In this stylized capitalist system, the three production sites, things now cease to be mere things and become, in addition, commodities produced solely for exchange on the market. They cease to be mere use values and become, in addition, exchange values. So there's this thing that happens, right? There are no permanent production relations between A and B initiated at the behest of a conscious agency. Production relations are now only established through the successful exchange of commodities. The relations that ensure the uninterrupted coordination of things are indirect, social, and transient. So the relations are established not directly via a conscious agency, but indirectly via the commodities successfully entering into an exchange for money. And we've looked at all those versions of that. The relations, whilst not indirect, remain social. So they're not indirect, but they are social. But two important changes have occurred. A, the temporal location where the social sanctioning takes place has changed vis-a-vis the production process from a priori to a posteriori. It is now not a production, but exchange value that the labor embodied in the commodity is recognized as socially necessary or not. See, this is that generalized question of productivism versus exchange, and all those things that we still worry about. And, you know, uh, you've already detached it in some ways from a labor question. Although I would assert that this does describe laboring. not labor power, but some version of laboring that is much more, let's say, um, well, anyway, B, the persons who do the sanctioning have changed from the conscious agency, that is producer side, to consumers of capital in this example. So you can see the capital can be used to describe both sides, as it were, of this activity. The now indirectly social relations only endure as long as commodity exchange endures. Hence, the relations are transient and in need of continual renewal or reproduction. So there's this it's fungible, but is perishable in that sense. So if and only if the commodity finds a buyer on the market, can the socioeconomic relations, and therefore the material technical relations, be established. Finding a buyer, right? Failure to sell results in the failure to establish relations of production, and therefore the failure of production and reproduction, as things still in inventory in the warehouse or whatever. The things themselves, the commodities, are now crucially important for the establishment and maintenance of the relations, therefore the coordination of the very process which produces them. Unlike non-commodity production, commodity production is based upon a curious system where it is the very existence of the product as a bona fide, bona fide commodity that creates the conditions for the reproduction of that commodity. And in all this, the market is crucial. You could describe this entire thing as a market, but then that kind of takes away the details. It is only via the market that the physiological, concrete, individual labor expended in the production of commodity doubles into a unity of itself and abstract and recognized as socially necessary. In other words, it is essentially via the market that one isolated producer comes to obtain implicit knowledge about the productive conditions of the multiplicity of other producers, and can therefore attempt to coordinate his or her laboring activities into these others, with these others. How well or how badly the market actually does this is irrelevant for the purposes of this paper. Now, the point is merely that under capitalism, the market is the process by which this coordination occurs. Now, you can see here, let me break for a second, and this is that issue of, for example, competition that Anwar Sheikh critiques, that it's not perfect. It doesn't, it's not perfectly, transitive in that sense. So there's other kinds of issues at work. It appears that this qualitative version of the LTV is explanatorily powerful and relevant. It explains how relations between people as producing units appear in the value form of a relation between things, that is commodities, by invoking the deep causal mechanisms that facilitate production and exchange under capitalism. So this is nothing new. I would assert that this is what Marx is talking about in volume 3, but except that the language is slightly different. So what kind of theory should the LTV be? At this point, the question that motivated this paper, namely, what kind of theory should the labor theory of value be, can finally be answered both negatively and positively. The LTV should not be the kind of theory that is quantitative in nature and rooted in the deductivist mode of theorization, because, lacking explanatory power, this kind of theory leads ultimately to irrelevance. The LTV should, by contrast, be the kind of theory that is qualitative in nature and rooted in the causal explanatory mode of theorization, because, unencumbered by pursuing inappropriate objectives and possessing explanatory power, this kind of theory leads ultimately to relevance. Now, this may be a problematic way of characterizing this, but will we continue? Moreover, by elaborating upon the conditions necessary for the reproduction of key socioeconomic relations, the qualitative version of the LTV presented here can be thought of in critical realist terminology as a transformational theory of socioeconomic order. Now, that alone has other issues built into it, but there's a certain structural familial similarity here that's worth pursuing. Anyway, the conclusion. None of the foregoing argument requires the abandonment of the basic premise of Marx's value analysis, namely that the reason commodities are valuable at all is because they involve human laboring activity, and the value form is the form in which this activity manifests itself under capitalism. What must be abandoned, however, is the untenable claim to complete exactness encouraged by the deductive model of theorization. Now, you could see here that this doesn't negate certain things. You could get into the details. You could render it as imprecise or as disordered or less precise as Sheikh describes the classical political economy that he's trying to fiddle around with. That is, that there is a certain disorder in this process that makes this possible. So I find myself in agreement with the following comment from Joan Robinson, because in it, she seems to put her finger on exactly what should and should not be abandoned in Marx's labor theory of value. Quote, by and large, the main determinant of difference in prices, say between a packet of pins and a motor car, is obviously differences in labor costs. Moreover, the movement through time of relative prices is predominantly influenced by changes in labor costs. By giving up the untenable claim to complete exactness, the labor theory can establish the right to be considered broadly true and highly important, close quote. So wedded to the deductive model of mode of theorizing, however, one cannot give up the untenable claim to complete exactness, because from this perspective, there is nothing else. So, I mean, you can assert that this may be unsatisfying at the end, but I think you can see what Fleetwood is driving at. That is, there's a certain subtlety to the argument, that there is ideological bias between the two things, or among things, and that you do require some kind of deep structure analysis. And with all due respect, because you are managing this with language and logic, uh, this is just, this is not problematic. And there should be no real problem that, his arguments, critical realist arguments about certain things that become irrelevant, I think are useful here. So anyway, now there's a lot of parsing out of certain ideas here, and uh, the separation between deductive things or deductivism as an ideological position, it is sort of has to be worked out as a function of a critique that is necessary from a causal explanatory point of view, and that by giving up one or by negating one, you don't necessarily prove the other. What you are doing is just simply tracing the territory between the two, or the boundary, such as they are, between the two, and providing a different way in which we can talk about the abstract process and the differences between the Department 1 and Department 2. And it's not magic that this occurs. It just simply is part of the process, and it requires a sort of system of analysis that is more fluid, let's put it that way, that it is is flow oriented in that sense. Um, but anyway, so that was this little article, which I've now finished in terms of prepping, and you can do with this what you will. I would assert to you, however, that it is possible to consider in a more uh, interesting way, I suppose, the next thing that we'll talk about. And I've sort of determined it to be, now that we've sort of trundled through this, um, the problem of actual, sort of empirical working. And by talking about them as empirical, you're not committing yourself to a certain type of deduction. Rather, one hopefully is open enough to assume that causal explanatory things are at work and that it's not driven by certain sets of precision that are not there. They're simply not there. As Shake points out, is that, the fact of competition, the fact that there is something going on here. Now, whether you want to talk about it as a quote unquote market is a whole different question. Well, not a whole different question, but it's a different question. Um, and that it would be important, I think, to consider how nature fits back into this once it becomes a resource problem. Um, Now, while that may not seem to be addressing the labor theory very well, I think you have to accept the fact that, without getting into a whole bunch of other things, that there is a kind of a clear set of relations, in Anthropocene wise or whatever, that there has to be some ecological connection between all of these, which gets us back to Engels, etc. So I think you can hopefully see why a critical realist point of view is important, because it does establish, um, it doesn't say that theory is ephemeral. Rather, it gives us a sense that you're always going to have to, there's a certain contestability that is, there's a discourse that is necessary before you sort of work into that. Anyway, so I got to the end of this, and I will now shut off the, what you've been looking at is this particular, we've been looking at this paper, the second half of what kind of theory is Marx's labor theory of value, and driven from a critical realist inquiry, which, sort of on the one hand adds new categories, but on the other hand, hopefully in that way of talking about certain things that we would have assumed decades ago were simply structural questions are now much more integrated or, imbricated in this kind of process. Anyway, so we've been looking at this article by Steve Fleetwood, and I hope that you got something out of it. I certainly did. So anyway,